Great. So hello everyone, good morning and good evening to those joining us in Australia. Welcome to this online event putting a spotlight on forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking to mark UK Anti-Slavery Day this week. I'm Miriam Kamali, I'm the Senior Advocacy Officer at Freedom United. Freedom United is a global community dedicated to taking action against all forms of modern day slavery and human trafficking, including forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking. Many of us may not automatically associate these crimes with contemporary forms of slavery. Through this event with our expert panel, we will be discussing these underreported forms of modern slavery, how they occur, and what some of the solutions are. So for those of you joining us on Zoom, feel free to drop a quick message in the chat box, just sharing where you're tuning in from. And we also invite you to share any questions you might have for the panel in the little Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Welcome everyone tuning in on Facebook Live. Please do leave any comments or questions you may have in the comment box, and we'll do our very best to get around to them at the Q&A section. And also a big thank you to everyone who has already sent in a question for the panel in the lead up to this event. I'm really excited to introduce our excellent speakers participating in this important discussion with us today. So I'm joined by Susie Hughes, the Executive Director of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, Tamara Barnett, Director of Operations at the Human Trafficking Foundation. Both organisations are partners on the Freedom United campaign to tackle forced organ harvesting, calling on national legislatures in every country to take up legislation to tackle these crimes at the international level. And please do take action on the campaign by clicking the link that will be dropped in the Zoom chat and the Facebook chat as well. We're also grateful to be joined by Lord Hunt of King's Heath, who will be joining a little bit later on. And he's working to push for the UK Parliament to address the issue of forced organ harvesting as it affects the UK. And Dr. Trevor Stammers, Associate Professor and Director of the Centre of Bioethics and Emerging Technologies at St. Mary's University, whose expertise includes the ethics of acquisition, donation and transplantation of organs. So thank you all so much for joining us. Really looking forward to this discussion. To get us started, Tamara, drawing on your experience in the anti-trafficking sector, perhaps you can give us an overview of what forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking are and how they relate to each other.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Because just always sometimes I start speaking and I'm on silent. So thank you, everyone. So actually, at the end of last year, I made an impassioned plea to our international group on human trafficking. I made a plea to look at organ trafficking in China, where there is wide-scale government organised organ abuse taking place. And afterwards, a couple of people actually came up to me from our sector and said they would really support this work, but that charities won't be able to help. It was also clear that many key universities relied on Chinese students or even had university bases in China and just didn't want to touch it at all. That's why I first want to thank Freedom United for taking the mantle and really leading this fight in our sector. So thank you. So human trafficking is described as the movement of a person from one place to another for the purposes of exploitation. And modern day slavery is described as traffickers and slave masters using whatever means they have at their disposal to coerce, deceive, and force individuals into a life of abuse, servitude, and or inhumane treatment. The taking of organs from vulnerable individuals is very clearly trafficking and modern day slavery, no matter where it is. Whether it is a woman being brought over to the UK from India to marry, so that her organs can be technically donated to her counterfeit husband, or refugees from Africa trying to get to Europe from Egypt, who are lied to by smugglers, told their journey can be accelerated by donating an organ or two. Or a homeless man in Romania, falsely promised money in return for a kidney, and unbeknownst to him, fatal health problems that will kill him. Or even where the government-approved type exists, as in China, where the Falun Gong practitioners have had their organs removed without even superficial consent, having been imprisoned for their religious beliefs, while Uyghur women have their hair removed right at this moment in so-called re-education camps that they are being forcibly housed in. There is no doubt this is slavery. So it is with sadness that I don't see our anti-slavery sector always being loud enough on this issue. And I think it will take time, just as it took time for the anti-slavery sector to recognise male victims and for the UK to recognise British victims. When the UN was creating the original anti-trafficking Palermo Protocol, One country wanted it to make it definitionally impossible for victims to be male. And I recall 8 years ago being told by someone who was seen as a leading national expert in human trafficking that the trafficking of British homeless men was just a rumour, something we now have tangible proof happens on a huge scale across the British Isles. With organ trafficking in China, it can feel very far away, but it isn't. You can go to China now and get an organ. You can go to the Body World show in London now, where it is understood that prisoners' bodies have been sold to the exhibition by the Chinese government. I was asked to touch on the drivers of modern-day slavery, and it's often a case of poverty or discrimination, such as discrimination around gender, that acts as a driver. We see that in Egypt, in Romania, India, Turkey, with organ trafficking. But in China, the drivers are purely based on ethnicity and faith. So the driver there is effectively world indifference. Like the Uyghurs in Falun Gong, 80 years ago, my own grandfather was a slave in a concentration camp. The Red Cross at the time looked away. I just hope we don't ourselves all repeat the same mistakes again. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara, for that useful insight. And as you mentioned, the issues of forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking are gathering traction in the anti-trafficking space and is being understood within the framework of contemporary forms of slavery. With this in mind, Dr. Trevor Stammers, drawing on your expertise and academic background, can you outline for us a bit more about how organ trafficking occurs from your perspective around the world and why there is such a high demand for illegal organs? So I think you're muted, Trevor.
Sorry about that. I think the demand for organs worldwide is a testament to transplantation being, in a way, a victim of its own success. And the increasing effects of, well, take, for example, the recent COVID pandemic, unfortunately mean that the demand for organs is going to go up, because along with things that we've had for ages, like diabetes, the effects of smoking, excess alcohol intake, and so on, all contributing towards organ failure, COVID also does exactly the same thing. And so there are always going to be pressures to find organs. And as Tamara has already illustrated, unfortunately, in a global community, particularly within organ trafficking, where you have groups of criminals essentially who are trafficking people and have no concern at all if they will die in the back of a van, you can understand if they have no regard for human life at all, they certainly will not have any qualms about promising people money to acquire their organs. And this does very much, it is a one-way traffic, mostly from the poor to the rich. And even in a country like Iran, which is the only country in the world that doesn't have a waiting list for organs, you see the same pattern, that mostly it is the poor whose organs end up in richer people. So it's a very complicated problem. And I think that one of the major issues that I certainly want to highlight today is that, as Tamara was saying, in the past, people trafficking was completely denied, didn't happen, was a myth. I think we still have the same issue with organ donation. And part of the problem with that, of course, is that unlike with people trafficking, you need doctors. You know, I'm a qualified medic. I practiced for almost 30 years. And unfortunately, it is the collusion of the medical profession, which is the absolute gateway that allows this to happen. And although organ trafficking is internationally illegal, unfortunately, transplant tourism is not. And the difference is that it is perfectly legal for someone to leave the UK or Japan to travel to China in a private hospital there to have an organ transplanted, the provenance of which is almost certainly that it has harvest and then to return to their home country and have no action taken against them at all. And although the number of officially recorded, when I last looked at the figures, crimes that had come to the National Crime Agency in connection with organ trafficking was only 6. I think A, this illustrates that it is happening, and B, how difficult it is to detect. And it's not until certainly those organizations like the ones that are involved in organizing this seminar today push organ trafficking up the agenda as part and parcel of this as a crime, that I think pressure can be put upon all the parties who are involved in it, and particularly doctors whom people will naturally think, you know, they're people who are here for our healing and our benefit. But doctors are no more immune to the pressures of government, to the pressures of commercial vested interests, and still remain human. And of course, indirectly, these doctors are responsible for the deaths of innocent people to supply the organs that they are transplanting.
Thank you, Trevor. That's really helpful to understand a bit more about how organ trafficking is facilitated, and particularly, you touch on the point about transplant tourism, which we will come to a bit more later on. Susie, your organisation, ETAC, is doing crucial work tackling forced organ harvesting in the context of China, where it is a state-sanctioned project occurring on a large scale. We have seen an increased awareness around the issue of forced organ harvesting since the independent China tribunal released its final judgment on forced organ harvesting in China earlier this year. Can you speak a little bit to your organization's role in pursuing this legal opinion, why the independent China tribunal was set up, and why its findings are so significant?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam. Look, this issue sat in a space of controversy for a very long time, and it's not difficult to understand why. It's a shocking situation where people who are incarcerated in vast numbers, blood test and organ scanned in detention. So we're talking about chest x-rays and ultrasounds. So they're forced into these medical examinations. And as other speakers tonight have mentioned, it's happening on a vast scale, and it has been happening for a very long time, so since sort of 1999. So that, I suppose, coupled with the fact that there are a lot of partnerships with China in many different sort of sectors, really has made it an issue that's been hard to get traction on. People really find it hard to believe it could possibly be happening. So our organisation, which is an organisation of advocates, and we have a lot of experts, we have a lot of human rights lawyers and different professionals from many different backgrounds, basically decided that we wanted to get an independent legal opinion on all of the evidence. So we approached Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, and Sir Geoffrey Nice was lead prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He's an expert in crimes of mass atrocity and very highly respected and regarded person. So originally we asked him for a legal opinion himself, and in his words, he sort of said, you know, if I do a legal opinion, it'll probably just sit on the shelf. So, you know, maybe you should consider initiating a people's tribunal. And at that point, we didn't really understand the significance of a people's tribunal, or really, you know, didn't really even know much about what a people's tribunal was. So after speaking with him and looking into other tribunals, so, you know, one of the first people's tribunals was the Russell Tribunal, we realised that it really was something that could help. And the reason why is because with a situation like this, and particularly because it's China, there's, you know, governments and international bodies are finding it very difficult to act, and certain sectors are actually turning a blind eye. So it's not a situation where it's going to be a formal court that's going to be looking at it just yet. So having a people's tribunal allowed us to have a situation that held the integrity of a formal court, because obviously you need someone like Sir Geoffrey to be holding that. But obviously doesn't have the ability to prosecute, but it was a robust assessment of all of the evidence. So there was 5 days of public hearings in London. The tribunal looked at official Chinese documents. They spoke to experts. They spoke to fact witnesses. So we had Uyghurs there who have, testified to having a black hood over the head and their organs scanned, and of course Falun Gong practitioners as well, which is the Buddhist Qigong practice you mentioned earlier. And over the course of 12 months, they looked at all of this evidence. So I guess, they've done the work for everybody. They've really looked at it. And Sir Geoffrey put a sort of a safeguard in place, and that was that there was counsel to the tribunal, and counsel to the tribunal was Hamid Sabi, and he was counsel to the Iran tribunal, and he sat as sort of like a shield, I suppose you could say, between us, and we're obviously an advocacy body, and the tribunal, to ensure that the assessment of the evidence was completely separate from the people who had urged them to take on that role. So over the course of 12 months, they assessed the evidence, and as you probably know, they came out with a judgment that yes, forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience has been happening for a significant number of years to a significant number of victims, and the people are killed in the process of the organs being removed. And basically it's been a game changer. Now we are having a lot of discussions with different dignitaries from different governments around the world, from the UN, obviously organizations like Freedom United, and it's really created this incredible focus and I guess a bridge for people to be able to grapple with this vast amount of evidence around the forced organ harvesting and the many different lines of evidence. It's all nicely sort of neatly packaged into this China tribunal judgment now. So yeah, it's made a huge difference, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Yeah, it's really great to hear just how big of an impact that work is having today. Thank you as well, Tamara and Trevor, for providing your thoughtful analyses of forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking. What we've seen is, the horrific nature and severity of these crimes makes it actually quite difficult to believe that only a small handful of countries have passed legislation to combat these crimes. In terms of what the UK can be doing to play its part in tackling forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking, Lord Hunt, welcome. I'd like to just pass over to you now to explain for our viewers, why is it important for the UK to be addressing this issue? And can you give us a bit of an overview of the work you're doing to encourage legislative change?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you for this important conference this morning. I took through a bill in the House of Lords towards the end of 2019 to actually change the law on organ donation in the UK. This was to change to a system of presumed consent. So we now assume that an adult has given consent to their organ being transplanted when the appropriate circumstances arise, unless they register not to do so. We hope that as a result of that, there will be more organ transplants and many more lives saved. But because we are now presuming that adults have given consent, it's absolutely essential that the system is seen to be 100% integrity-wise and transparency-wise. And that goes nationally, of course, for the UK, but also internationally. And so I became, as a result of that, very, very interested in the serious issues in China with the enforced transplant of organs from prisoners of conscience, from minorities who are being persecuted. And with other colleagues in the House of Lords, we've been working to put pressure on the UK government to take a more vigorous stand and actually to start to see if we can change the law so that people, at least from the UK, and companies cannot actually take part in these terrible activities.
Great, thank you, Lord Hunt. for all the important work you're doing to push for legislative change in the UK, and for outlining how individual countries are able to take action against forced organ harvesting. For our viewers, you can also show your support by adding your name to the campaign to stop forced organ harvesting. So you would just need to visit freedomlighterorg/advocate/forced-organ-harvesting, and we'll also drop the link into the chat. So beyond legislation, effectively tackling any form of modern day slavery requires a holistic approach and an understanding of the wider structural issues that create vulnerability to situations of modern slavery. With this in mind, Tamara, I'd like to pass over to you now. I know that you touched a little bit on this earlier, but what are some of the conditions that make certain groups more vulnerable to being targeted by organ traffickers?
So, I mean, one of the sort of traditional drivers, I think, is often poverty, because often there's a promise, in most cases outside of sort of government examples like China, of sort of financial payment. So generally there's some sort of poverty element that drives an individual to take this risk. There might often be maybe a lack of awareness around the risks. So as well as poverty, there might be sort of lack of education. There might be people with potentially who are sort of vulnerable anyway as adults. They might have learning difficulties, etc. So they might be even more easily taken advantage of. But we know certainly these sort of big drivers are just poverty and desperation, and that can be caused by wars, that can be caused by gender issues, so people escaping violent families and relationships, people escaping families because of sexuality. So it's a range of things. In most of the world, it tends to be a vulnerability that the trafficker then exploits, and definitely poverty and desperation, and certain elements around discrimination can play a role in how that happens.
Absolutely. And Trevor, I just wanted to pass over to you to see if you had anything else to add, and with regards to what fundamental changes we need to see if organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting are to be tackled in a sustainable way.
I think one of the things that became very evident to me when I was researching for a chapter that I wrote for a book last year for Oxford University Press was, I called that chapter A Dark Convergence, Trafficking, Tourism and Trading. And not only was that sort of triad present, I was also amazed that not only were doctors that I've also alluded to, and some kidney doctors and renal surgeons, supporting the idea, certainly of trading and tourism, or seeming to do so. But also there are many economists who are writing about the importance of purchasing organs, and philosophers too. And in particular, I think that Patricia, Janet Radcliffe Richards' book, Careless Thought Costs Lives, which is rather an ironic title, I think. She has the extraordinary statement in there that, you know, the people who are poor would not sell their organs if they didn't think they could benefit from it. And there's no such thing as an irresistible offer. So whilst people are making claims in popular paperbacks of this nature, I think that it gives a justification for the idea that it is perfectly acceptable for body parts to be marketed. So it's against that backdrop that the more specific crime of obviously, in some cases, killing people to order for their organs is at the far end of a much wider spectrum. So I think it makes it very difficult. And I just want to illustrate, to me, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that this is happening, aside from the People's Tribunal, which I attended and heard some of those stories from people who had escaped from these camps and so on. Earlier this year in the Global Times, a Chinese newspaper, there was a report where the Chinese government were, in one way, understandably, parading the triumph of a successful double lung transplant. in a Chinese citizen who got COVID in the January of that year. And the report says that the donor was a non-local donor, and the lungs had been sped to the hospital where the transplant was carried out 7 hours by high-speed train. Now, the speed with which they found 2 lungs that were compatible with this person who'd gone down with COVID in January, they must have found those so quickly that many people were raising questions about how this could be done unless the person had been killed to order in order to supply them, because you would usually wait many months or years to find a suitable transplant by conventional means. So there is a great deal that needs to be exposed here. And sadly, I had an experience with this, I'll just close, just recently of being on a panel in a country at a very well-known medical school where we were talking about organ trading. And sadly, the leading surgeon from that country who had recently been out to China doing training and so on, and I understand the camaraderie between doctors. I could feel him freeze when I confessed my link with ETAC. And he started to say, well, things are getting better and so on. And this defensiveness in front of the evidence that people are being killed to order to supply organs. There is a huge uphill battle, and it's no wonder that governments around the world would rather turn their back on it. And I'm very grateful that we have Lord Hunt here as a counterexample of someone who wants to do something about it.
Thank you, Trevor. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us and shedding light on some of the causes and solutions of forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking through a modern slavery perspective. We're now going to move on to our audience Q&A section. We have loads of questions. Thank you all so much for participating. So our first question, we are going to direct this one to Lord Hunt. There's no talk at all of modern slavery in electoral times in my country, Argentina. What kind of changes need to happen, in your opinion, to have more legislators raise the topic and pass laws around it?
Hello, it's a very good question. A few years ago, we were not debating the issue of organ transplants in China. Over the last 5 to 10 years, a group of committed people, including the organization that we're now speaking with, and many others, badgered politicians, encouraged them to raise issues, and gradually we built up a momentum. And at last, I feel we're knocking on the door of government to actually agree that Parliament will have the ability to change the law and change attitudes. But it has taken time, but it started with a very small group of committed campaigners persuading people like me that this was important. And I think whichever country you're in, whichever political system you have, in the end, one has to campaign, get it to people's attention, and then politicians, I believe, will pick this up. And the more internationally that we can do together, the more we can share our experience, the more countries that actually pass laws in relation to what is happening, the more momentum we'll create.
Great, thank you so much, Lord Hunt. Moving on to our next question. Is there a role for bans or blocking imports of organs from particular countries or regions to reduce demand? Perhaps Trevor Stammers or Susie Hughes could touch on this.
I'm going to let Susie take the detail of that, but I would say that, of course, where you have criminal gangs and people wanting to participate in this trade, whether there is a ban or not, stopping it and enforcing it is a very, very difficult job.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah, look, I guess it depends on you know, whether the question's talking about stopping citizens of their own country from, you know, traveling to somewhere like China or another country to receive an organ. At this point in time, the technology, you know, there are new technologies. There's one called ECMO, which actually keeps organs longer in this sort of box. I mean, I'm terrible at explaining these sorts of medical devices, but it's a medical device and the organ can be kept longer. This sort of thing is quite concerning because even, you know, the situation we have with the Uyghurs, how they're sort of, you know, situated in one part of the country, then this sort of medical technology could actually potentially and may actually be happening now, transferring organs around the country. If that technology develops further, then I suppose in the future there's going to be the possibility of those organs actually being able to be sent to another country and to be implanted, you know. And I think with in regards to this question, instead of, you know, just looking at what's happening now and what we need to do now, which are obviously putting into place laws around transplant tourism, so that, you know, in our own countries we're responsible and, you know, we stop the trade coming from our own countries. We need to also look a little bit ahead, because we sort of always seem to be on the back foot where we're jumping to try and create laws once there's a huge problem, whereas we know these technologies, for example, are developing. We really should be looking at what we can do to make sure that we're not importing any body tissue. And I know this is something that's happening in the UK, which perhaps Lord Hunt could speak more about, you know, that there's no blood plasma products coming from other countries, there's no organs, or, you know, we talked before, I think it was Tamara mentioned the bodies exhibits, so, you know, plastinated bodies. So I really do think it's sort of legislation across the board and really looking carefully at where we can improve the legislation that we already have and where we really do need to be starting to look into what problems could be happening in the near future and creating new legislations to deal with that.
Great, thank you, Susie. Our next question: are there organs being harvested illegally within the UK? And is there a real chance of an organ by force being used in a local operation in the UK? How would we know?
Would you like me to start on that one? I have I'm in contact with a doctoral student who is looking to investigate this, and I have sent to Freedom United a couple of slides which will be available for viewers, one of which relates to a newspaper article in 2015 where a 12-year-old boy was in the UK, and the police were involved in that case, and it was thought that he was here for the purposes of his organs being removed. And I would just say, of course, that child slavery, the trafficking of organs in teenagers, they are particularly valuable because they are mature organs of an appropriate size, and all other things being equal, they will kind of last for years. And I mean, I just never thought I would hear myself, you know, sort of talking about body parts as if you were replacing a catalytic converter on a car. It's just absolutely extraordinary. So I think it is happening here, and you know, anecdotes are dangerous because people can make them up. But at a local medical dinner last year, in the sort of camaraderie after these events, going out to the car park, a retired consultant nephrologist was telling me that a colleague of his had seen in outpatients someone recently whose organ transplant he felt had been of either a tourism situation, and he wasn't going to explore that any further. But I think some kind of legislation that if doctors suspect that they are either as physicians or dealing post-operatively with a complication of a trafficked organ or one that was acquired illegally, that some means of notification and so on becomes mandatory, because the tendency is for professionals always to cover their back, not get involved with anything that, you know, may be out of the ordinary just in case. That's not good enough when children are being brought over here to have their kidneys taken out and possibly die as a result.
Thank you, Dr. Trevor Stammers, for your response. Lord Hunt, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about the organ tourism and cadavers on display bill, and if you could explain a little bit about what the impact of that bill would be if it were to be passed into law and why it's needed.
Well, it's very relevant to the contribution we've just heard from Trevor, because this is a separate piece of legislation that I'm also working on. And one of the things we want to do is place a requirement on doctors and other people working in the health service to report incidents, as he mentioned, where it may be suspected that a recipient of an organ, it came through organ tourism. If you think about it, if someone from the UK went to China, paid to have an organ, they will come back and they will need follow-up treatment, and they will turn to hospitals in the UK. So I hope, if I can persuade Parliament to give me time, that at some point we might legislate to do just as Trevor suggests we should do. I think I should also say that the official system of organ transplants, I believe, is totally above board. We have some really dedicated staff committed to organ transplants. And I do want to draw a distinction between illegal activity or very disreputable activity and the mainstream, where I believe we do have a very good system.
Yeah, I would absolutely support that. And the incidents that, the few incidents I'm aware of, are largely related in the private sector, where it is much more difficult to be absolutely sure what's going on all the time.
I think the more we can raise this, the more we can pass laws, the more people become aware. And really, in the end of the day, I think it should be absolutely unacceptable from anyone in the UK to go abroad in these circumstances where an organ is accepted without that person giving consent. And I'm very clear that we ought to legislate for that.
Thank you, Lord Hunt and Dr. Stammers. So perhaps, Tamara, you could touch on the next question. What happens to the victims and who buys the organs?
So in terms of what happens to the victims, I mean, for example, there was recently a documentary looking at organ trafficking in Egypt. And there certainly are people who were selling their organs and seemed to survive and sometimes even get some of the money. But we know that in many cases, I know that the case that became quite famous, I believe, in Europe, where it was, I think, maybe it was a teenager who sort of donated organs for money in sort of a legal criminal network. And in his case, he died, and that's how the case became sort of quite well known. And I think we know that in many cases, this is not done by people. It's not done by caring, do no harm type of doctors, unfortunately. So we know anyway these can have an effect on impact health, even in the best case circumstances. But unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that actually it sort of affects people very badly. And the people, though, asking for, I mean, I think it's important to realize that there must be people going abroad to get organs who don't necessarily know about trafficking. I think that I think there is an ignorance. I'm aware that I think the Israel's been one of the countries that's sort of done quite a lot of work around tackling organ trafficking. I think it came from a doctor being aware that his client was trying to get an organ and struggling in Israel, and then found out there was an option to get one very quickly, I think, in China. So I think that that person was just desperate. And when your child needs an organ, I can understand why you'd be like looking all over and possibly turning a blind eye to the questions that might come up in your mind, like where did this organ come from? In the same way that we buy cheap goods in the UK that sort of don't make sense in terms of if it must have taken several hours to make a piece of clothing and yet it costs £5. So I think there's an element of all people turning a blind eye to potential trafficking and slavery. So I don't necessarily think the people who receive these organs should be treated necessarily as criminals, but I think certainly by making it illegal, then we sort of highlight the point. And I think that's why what Lord Hunt's doing is so important, because actually if people are aware that actually this is a crime, then most normal people would stop doing it. And I think that's the only way to sort of get this message through really to people, because otherwise they just don't think, and in desperate circumstances, people make desperate decisions.
Thank you, Tamara, for that really useful insight. Thinking internationally and on the international stage, and organizations like the United Nations, how has the UN addressed organ trafficking, if at all? And what role do bodies like the UN have in driving change and accountability? Perhaps Susie, you can speak to this.
Thanks, Miriam. Now, I might have to defer to Tamara or someone else in regards to other types of organ trafficking in regards to the UN, because I'm not sure our organisation really does focus quite specifically on China. The issue of forced organ harvesting in China was brought to the UN's attention many years ago, and I think it was actually Amnesty International. I remember there was a speech that was given on the floor of the Human Rights Council. Look, it's a difficult situation, as we all are probably aware, that China has quite a strong influence, particularly in the Human Rights Council, which, and a number of sort of countries that tend to support whatever it is that China decides or recommends. So it feels like there needs to be a significant shift in the way things work. Having said that, we have had some really positive discussions and conversations since the China Tribunal. And once again, this is sort of demonstrating how important it is that Sir Geoffrey and the other members of the Tribunal have analysed this evidence, because now they have, I guess, this judgment, which includes, phenomenal number of different testimonies and a huge appendices of reports that, of course, they still have to delve into, but at least it's the reasoning behind why they believe it is happening and has been happening is laid out very clearly in the judgment. One thing that we are really urging for, and a number of organisations are supporting that as well, is a commission of inquiry into forced organ harvesting in China. Specifically, and a commission of inquiry could be initiated by the Human Rights Council. It could come through the General Assembly. It can come through the Special Procedures or the High Commissioner's Office. So these sorts of things can happen. There are steps that need to happen before that, probably, and one of the biggest ones is speaking out, and that's what we're really hoping for, and that's what we're starting to see from governments around the world now, and different people are really speaking out about this, and what we're hoping is that the UN will speak out as well, and then we can start looking at what sort of formal investigation needs to happen into this horrendous situation.
Thank you, Susie. I don't know if any other panelists would like to touch on what Susie has mentioned with regards to the UN. Or we can move on. So, Dr. Trevor Stammers, we have a question here that I think you might be best placed to respond to. So, who is creating the demand for human organs, and do black market hospitals exist? In this question, there's no, they don't specify in a specific country context. So perhaps you can just give an overview of this might look like generally.
Okay, I think it does vary from place to place, depending on the system of medicine. I think it would be fair to say that the sheer figures and volumes of transplants involved in China almost certainly indicates that there is, sadly, a nationwide practice of using organs that are of doubtful provenance in transplantation units in every city in China, probably. It's such an industrial scale, sadly. The market for it, of course, is the fact that people will die without the organ supplies, and people will do anything, including not asking questions about where the organ came from, either as recipients or those transplanting it, if the market is there, and clearly it is there, and it sounds such an antithetical thing to the principle of medicine. And transplantation has certainly been probably the greatest medical advance, I think, of the late 20th century. And it's just such an irony that trust in it is being undermined. And one of the big fears that I have is that even a system like our own, which I agree currently is very, very robust. You only need just one incident, as happened in Japan, as has happened in Singapore, to undermine public trust in the newspapers. And then even the legitimate setup becomes tarnished by that too. So this could turn very, very sour indeed if we allow this kind of activity to continue.
Thank you, Dr. Stammers.
I don't know, could I come in on that?
Yes, of course.
I just agree very much with it. I mean, the problem we have is there is a shortage of organs for transplant in many countries. And that's why, you know, I came in on this because I wanted to encourage people in the UK to increase donations. And even with the change in law to presume consent, at the end of the day, relatives will still have a strong say in whether an organ should be transplanted. And if the person, the potential donor, has not told their relatives of their intention, even with the change in the law, a transplant may not take place. And so the two things go together. We need a huge campaign to encourage people to actually say to people, yes, I do agree to my organs being transplanted. And the more we can increase the number of organs available, the less there'll be a black market. And I think the integrity of the official system therefore becomes absolutely critical to this. And that's why those of us who are involved in the official systems, one way or another, need to be very, very strong about China and any other country which allows these terrible practices to be undertaken.
It's crucially important that people make known, and even young people, all my students, when I lecture on donation, I say to them, last year I said to them, sign up on the register and tell your relatives that you've done so. And of course, it's difficult because for deceased donation, it means thinking about one's own mortality, but we need to be realistic. One day we will all die, and being prepared to donate our organs after death costs nothing except foresight and the courage to tell your relatives what you would like. And I mean, I certainly made that clear to my family, children, and so on. And if the one outcome from this is every person who listens to this video and is watching live deals with that straight after the webinar, then there'll be some good progress there too.
Thank you, Trevor. So we just received another question, and I think, Trevor, this one would be directed to you as well. Do you know if organ harvesting and illegal transplants are addressed in medical schools at all? Education and awareness on the part of the next generation of surgeons is vital given their essential role.
I can't speak for the whole country, because the teaching of medical ethics is growing in this country. But I can certainly say that within the past year, in a university other than my own, I was invited to guest lecture at a summer school for, in fact, a group of Chinese students. And I did contact the organizer and said I'd be very, very happy to do that. But you do need to know that these are my affiliations, and are you happy for me to speak freely about these things? And it was quite extraordinary. I mean, I was perhaps more temperate than I've been in this webinar, but those Chinese students really engaged extraordinarily well. Now, I don't know whether they had a minder who's, you know, sort of put me on a list and so on, but I can say that the vast majority, if those medical students were representational of those being trained in China, they will know that trust in transplantation is incredibly important. And I think, you know, most young doctors do enter, and clearly it's not just doctors, nurses, operating assistants and so on, with a genuine desire to do the very best for their patients, as we've seen through COVID. And clapping the NHS is clapping a service that deserves it. We must make sure that we don't lose that trust.
Thank you, Trevor. So we have touched quite a lot on China and forced organ harvesting in the context of China. Tamara, I know that you took part in the BBC Panorama documentary that looked at the issue of organ trafficking in Egypt. And we have a question here. How can anti-slavery agencies help in raising awareness of this modern day slavery issue in Africa?
I mean, it's always a challenge with awareness raising, because what we find with human trafficking is there's a lot of money spent in our sector trying to raise awareness. And what happens is often the people who make the decisions that make them fall into exploitation, whether it's organ harvesting, labor trafficking, sexual exploitation, there tends to be a view that it won't go wrong for me. And the reason why they're making those decisions is because they're already at that point where things are desperate. So I think you can do awareness raising and certainly sort of work in these countries that we know, you know, people are coming from into Egypt from, you know, Eritrea and Sudan, and sort of raise awareness of the risks around organ trafficking, the fact that you're unlikely to get the money you've been promised, the health risks. And I think it will have some impact, because I think often there is complete ignorance around this issue, including, you know, amongst people in the West as well. So I think a certain amount of education can work, but I do think one needs to remember that people who make these choices, if you can call them that, are at a point of such desperation that often, you know, that, you know, people aren't stupid. That they know, you know, they know there's a risk, and they make that choice. They weigh things up, and things are so desperate where they're trying to get away from, for example, that they make that decision. So I think awareness raising is quite a challenge. I think in the UK, I saw actually there's one of the questions, someone says they work as a GP, and they're, you know, what to do with people who want to bring their relatives. I think it's raising awareness. Like, for example, we've heard anecdotally, I think I touched on it in my talk, that there are cases of families, for example, bringing over someone and pretend and sort of having a kind of fake wife or husband. So because obviously our system is very secure, but you are allowed to donate if you're a family member, etc. So using that system. So the person in the Q&A who says they're a GP, I would assess that very, very carefully. And I think it's just awareness of realizing that this happens amongst the medical professional staff in the UK could make a real difference. But I think in terms of the types we're talking about in places like in Egypt and India, I think we'll need to understand that actually the drivers are poverty, desperation, war, gender discrimination, corruption, and it's tackling those things that will actually have more impact than sort of spending huge amounts on awareness campaigns. It's actually the drivers we need to be dealing with, rather than trying to sort of create sticking plasters along the journey.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. Lord Hunt, we have a question here for you. Given UK relations with China and trade negotiations, how optimistic do you consider outcomes for pushing forward any legislation and enforcement?
That is a very good question, and it's a question being asked by many parliamentarians at the moment. The debate about China's investment, for instance, in UK infrastructure over the last 12 months has shown an increasing concern about human rights issues alongside security issues. And I think actually creates circumstances where there may well be more sympathy for the kind of things we're trying to do. One bill going through the House of Lords at the moment is the trade bill. And I'm supporting an amendment which would exclude companies explicit in atrocities suffered by the Uyghur Muslims from gaining access to UK's telecommunications infrastructure. Now, the government is not very keen on this, but a lot of their MPs actually are concerned. And, you know, I am hopeful that the more pressure we put on, the more bits of legislation that we seek to influence, it will lead to an eventual change in government policy in relation to human rights issues. It's a very big issue. The UK is looking for a massive £1 billion investment in its infrastructure. China is clearly a country which has invested very much in the UK in the last few years. So we should not underestimate some of the tension there is between ethical, human rights-based foreign policy and the financial issues for a country. But my sense is more and more people in the UK are prepared to stand up, even at an economic consequence.
Thank you, Lord Hunt. That is encouraging. We just have one final question before we come to a close. And this one is for Susie. As a student, I would like to know, what can young people do to raise awareness and help stop live forced organ harvesting in China?
Thank you. It's a really great question to end on, actually. And look, one of the most important things is to talk about it. And it's interesting because people sort of, you know, expect that there's got to be something really sort of time consuming or difficult that they need to do. But actually talking about this issue is what is going to help people realize that it's happening. It's one of those issues it's a really horrible issue. Any kind of organ trafficking is, and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. It's, you know, oh, that issue, and they want to change the topic. And I think one of the biggest things is to, you know, for this particular student or anyone that's a student, to talk to their lecturers about it, you know, talk to their other students about it. There's lots of different student groups within universities that they could, you know, there can be, I suppose, experts that can come and speak about the issue. There's a couple of really fantastic documentaries and really helping with that, you know, Tamara made a point recently about raising awareness, and that's the best thing that you can do. Of course, then the next step is also to lobby for legislation change and to support things that are happening on that level as well. I mean, we do have a student movement at ETAC, so people can contact us at endtransplantabuse.org. And also, I hadn't mentioned the website, but chinatribunal.com is where you can, you know, read about the judgment and even watch the testimonies of the people there that spoke to the tribunal about their experiences. So, yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you, Susie. That's really helpful. So we've now reached the end of the webinar. I just want to say a big, big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this morning and this evening in Australia, and for all of you tuning in and participating in this discussion. To reiterate what our panelists have touched on and what Susie's just said now, your voice does make a difference. And the more of us there are raising awareness of forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking, the greater the chances of keeping these issues in the public eye and pushing governments to act. So on that note, please take action, sign, share the campaign this UK Anti-Slavery Week. I believe we'll be dropping the link to the campaign in the chats again, and you can also find it at freedomlighter.org/advocate/forced-organ-harvesting. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.